Toki, mian Misali, ni li sitelen tawa sin lon kulupu pi sitelen tawa ni, sina ken kama sona e tokipona. Sitelen tawa ni li o e sona pi nimi tan toki ante e sona pi nimi o. This is the third video in a series about tokipona. In the previous lesson, we learned about the particle a and the fundamental structure of tokipona sentences. Let's try another sentence as a refresher. What would yan suli ni li pali e moku mute mean? Good. It's something like, that tall person made a lot of food, with some room for variation in the exact phrasing. Now, let's talk about names. Proper names in tokipona work a little bit differently from how you're probably used to. Tokipona is an engineered language, designed in such a way that talking about any specific thing requires explaining what that thing is, and the way names work in the language is no exception. In tokipona, proper names are adjectives, not nouns. What this means is that you can't just use a name on its own, like you can in English. It needs to modify another word. For example, someone named Lisa wouldn't just be Lisa in tokipona, she'd be Yan Lisa, with the adjective Lisa modifying the noun Yan. Literally, this means the Lisa person, or you could think of it as meaning the person named Lisa. Also, note that names are capitalized. Officially, this is the only context where tokipona uses capital letters, since the beginnings of sentences are not capitalized. This doesn't just apply to people, of course. In principle, literally anything could have a name, so there's no restrictions on what nouns a name can modify. Like if you're talking about places, the name of the place modifies ma, which means land or place. So a country called Canada could be ma Kanata in tokipona, the Kanata place, or the land called Kanata. Oh, also, you don't need to memorize tokipona names of countries. In a few minutes we're going to go over how to derive something like this by yourself. Here's another useful one. Kulupu means group, collection, community, organization, and other things like that. An organization called Soni, if such an organization existed, could be translated as kulupu Soni. Oh, and that's kulupu, not kulupu. In tokipona, the first syllable of a word is the one that's stressed, no matter how long it is. That's why it was ma Kanata in that last example and not ma Kanata. Now, there is one little thing. As you might remember, tokipona only uses 14 letters of the alphabet. While you can just take whatever name and use it as an adjective, it's generally recommended that names be converted into tokipona first. Doing this requires a more complete understanding of the way tokipona's sound system works than what we've already gone over in previous lessons. Which means now I get to spend a good chunk of this video talking about phonology. As was mentioned in the first lesson, tokipona uses these 9 consonants and these 5 vowels. These can be formed into 92 syllables. Don't memorize this chart. It'll be way easier to just learn the handful of rules that determine what syllables exist. Every syllable has a vowel, which can be preceded by any of the 9 consonants or no consonant. A syllable can also end with the letter N. This is the only consonant that can appear at the end of a syllable. Great, so that's 10 possible starts of syllables, 5 middles, and 2 ends, or onsets, nuclei, and codas if you want to use their cool names. Don't worry, those terms won't be on the test. Together, that multiplies to a total of 100 possible syllables. However, there's some additional restrictions that bring that number down. First, the consonant y isn't allowed before e, since it can be hard to hear the difference between y and e. For similar reasons, w doesn't appear before vowels that are pronounced with rounded lips, so wu and wo aren't allowed either. Then there's the other one that's a little weirder. T isn't allowed, since for speakers of some languages, distinguishing between all 3 of T, ki, and C can be hard. So tokipona makes that easier by only having ki and C. So if you remove yi, wu, wo, and T, plus the versions of those syllables that end with N, that's what gets you to the final set of 92 syllables in the language. Naturally, you can't just put any syllables in any order. There's a couple more rules for how tokipona words are formed that only apply with words that are longer than a single syllable. 1. Syllables without a starting consonant are only allowed as the first syllable of a word. So within a word, you can't have 2 vowels in a row, and also you can't have one syllable that ends with N immediately followed by a vowel. And 2, syllables that end with N are not allowed before syllables that start with nasal consonants, that is, the consonants M or N. So you can't have a word that contains double N or NM. And okay, that's actually everything. It's not that hard. Now that we know what sounds are and aren't allowed and where, we can start translating some names into tokipona. It's generally accepted in the tokipona community for each speaker to have a tokiponized form of their own name. If you want to keep maximum clarity for more well-known figures, it's okay to say things like Yan Toby Fox or Yan Tsunku, but in actual conversations with tokipona speakers, people tend to refer to things in their tokiponized forms, both because it makes the names fit in better with the rest of the language, and because it's more fun. This means that you watching at home get to make a tokipona form of your own name too if you want. Because of how few sounds tokipona has, there are a lot of concessions you'll have to make when converting names into tokipona acceptable forms. Some names work very nicely, like the previously mentioned Yan Lisa, but some take a good bit more work to get into a form that's recognizable while still looking good as a name. Here, we can go through a few examples and I'll show you a few common strategies. Okay, let's take the name Betty. Tokipona doesn't have the sound b but that can be approximated with p instead. If you aren't familiar with the concept, consonants can be either voiced or voiceless, which refers to whether or not your vocal cords vibrate when you pronounce them. Tokipona, like many natural languages, does not make this distinction. What this means is that when you're tokiponizing a name, voiced consonants can be replaced with their voiceless equivalents. B becomes p, d becomes t, g becomes k, and z becomes s. Even if you don't understand how these sounds are formed, you should be able to hear and feel the way these pairs are very similar. Yan Peti comes close to Betty, but remember the syllable T isn't allowed, so it needs to be replaced with something else. The official recommendation is to replace T with C, Yan Pesi, but you could also do Te or even Ki. It's ultimately up to the person the name refers to decide which approximation is the best for them. How about the language Farsi? It's a language, so the name should be an adjective that modifies Toki. Tokipona almost has everything necessary for this name. The letter R doesn't exist, and even if it did, it couldn't go at the end of a syllable since the only consonant allowed there is N, but we can just remove it. Tokipona also doesn't have a F sound. The closest thing to F in Tokipona is P, so you get Tokipasi. Another name that doesn't need that much work to Tokiponize it is the country Tuvalu. The only sound missing is the V in the middle. There's a couple options here. You could use P again, Matupalu, but the most common approximation for this sound is W, Matuwalu. The letter R is a tricky one. R is pronounced in a lot of different ways in a lot of different languages, so which Tokipona consonant R is closest to can vary a lot. My favorite example of this is the way this language differentiates between America, the country, and America, the continent. The continent America, as in the Americas, is given the straightforward name Ma'amalika, replacing the R with L. But the country America, as in the United States, has a commonly accepted Tokipona name based specifically on American English. In American English, as in most other major English dialects, the letter R isn't pronounced very much like L. It's close, but you can do better. The main Tokipona name for the United States is Mamewika, using W as an approximation for English R. So for a lot of languages, you approximate their R sounds with L, but for English, you can use W instead. Obviously, it's all very loose and there's no strict rules beyond go with whatever consonant is closest to the specific pronunciation, but that's how it works in general. Now, this is all fine and good, but not all names can be Tokiponized by just replacing a few of their individual sounds. If you wanted to talk about your cousin Throckmorton, that name is simply not shaped like a Tokipona word. A name like Throckmorton contains a couple sequences of multiple consonant sounds in a row, what we in the business call consonant clusters. There are a couple different ways you can deal with these. One option is to drop some consonants, keeping the name the same number of syllables but losing some sounds, like we saw with the Tokipasi example from before, doing something like Yan Tamoton or Yan Samoton. Another option is to insert filler vowels between the consonants, like Yan Suakumoton. Exactly what vowels you use doesn't matter that much for this. It's common practice to use vowels that already appear in the name, but you can really do whatever you want. Combining these different methods together along with the different ways to approximate individual sounds, there are a lot of combinations you might want to try before settling on the version of the name that works best for the specific person you're talking about. And of course, if your cousin usually goes by Thraki, then using his full name in the first place might be the wrong approach. The single most important factor for someone's Tokipona name is their own preference. Now here's a name with the opposite problem, Hawaii. So first, for some consonants like the H and the Okina in Hawaii, the closest approximation is no consonant at all, as in silence. But what you're left with after that is a name that has too many vowels in a row. Similar to what you do with consonant clusters, you can deal with these vowel sequences either by dropping some vowels or by inserting filler consonants between them. Something like Ma'awayi would be very close to the real name, but yi isn't allowed in Tokipona, so you gotta do something else like Ma'awaye, Ma'awawi, or Ma'awaki. Another important thing to keep in mind is that in Tokipona, places or languages use the name the group uses for themselves, in their own language. This is called an endonym, as opposed to an exonym, a name for a group used by people outside of that group. Let's look at some examples. In Mandarin Chinese, China is called Zhongguo. We can adapt this into Tokipona as Masonko. The German word for the German language is Deutsch, which can be Tokiponized into Tokitosi. You can think of this first being approximated as Tokitois, and then being rearranged to fit the shape of a Tokipona word. It's also recommended that when a language and a country have endonyms that are related to each other, the Tokipona words for those things should be the same. Therefore, Germany is Matosi from Deutsch, instead of something like Matosiland from Deutschland. One more of these, the country Japan refers to itself as either Nippon or Nihon. So can you figure out how you translate these names into Tokipona? Right, so Nippon simply becomes Manippon. For the other pronunciation, Tokipona doesn't have a h sound, so we can do what we did in the Hawaii example earlier and make it Maniyon. Which of these terms gets used may vary depending on the preference of the speaker, but in practice, Maniyon is more common. All that's really important is to match what the country would be called by a speaker of Tokiniyon. Okay, this has been a lot of time going over how Tokiponization works. Don't worry if you didn't get all that. The only time you really need to know this stuff is when you're deciding what you want your own Tokipona name to be, which can be whatever you want. Regardless of what any of these other rules rules might suggest, the correct way to refer to someone in tokipona is whatever name they want to be called. This is also true about names in English. Let's finally get to this lesson's grammatical particle. O is a particle used for marking verbs in the imperative. That is, it's used for commands, when you're telling someone to do something. This will be easiest with examples, so let's start with the basic sentence, Yan keisi limoku. The keisi person eats. This sentence is describing something that Yan keisi does, but suppose you're talking to Yan keisi, not about her, and you want to tell her to eat. Well, what you do is take the li in the sentence and replace it with o. Yan keisi o moku. The thing before o, the subject of the sentence, is the person being addressed, and the thing after o, the verb, is the thing you're telling them to do. Now, often, you'll want to tell someone to do something without addressing them by name. You know, it can be polite to use someone's name when you're talking to them, but it's not always necessary. So, what you can do is remove the subject of a sentence altogether. You can say something like olukine ni for look at this. No subject required. Okay, question. How does this work if the thing after the o is a noun or an adjective? Like, what do you think o pona means? Well, pona as a verb means be good, right? So that's what it means here. Just like li, o indicates that the word after it is being used as a verb. Side note, this is part of why I don't think it's very helpful to think of the particle li in a sentence like olin li pona as meaning is. It works fine for some basic sentences, but once more advanced grammatical concepts get introduced, it makes less sense. Anyway, here's the fun part. You can remove the part before the o to tell someone to do something without indicating who you're talking to, but you can also remove the part after the o to indicate who you're talking to without telling them to do something. On its own, this can be used as just like a way to get someone's attention, but the ability to specify who you're talking to is just generally very useful. Like, you can say yan pona mi o, indicating that you're talking to your friend, and then follow that up with the thing you want to tell them, as in yan pona mi o lape li suli. People usually write this with a comma separating the two parts here, but officially there are no rules for punctuation in this language and you can do whatever you want. So, let's go over the rest of this lesson's vocabulary. Nasin means way, both as in path and as in method. It's also used when talking about philosophies, ideologies, and religions. Nimi means word or name. Lipu, fundamentally, means page or sheet of paper. This is generalized in two different ways. Lipu can refer to any book or document of any kind, and it also can refer to any flat and bendable object, anything that's shaped like a sheet of paper. Sitelen means image or text. Remember, stress goes on the first syllable. Sitelen. Here's a useful pair of adjectives. Seli means hot, and lete means cold. Oh, here's something you might be able to figure out. What would something like o seli e moku mean? Yeah, using seli as a verb with an object, it means cause to become hot. So this is saying heat up the food or cook the meal. See the previous lesson if you need a refresher on how that works. Here's one of my favorites. Mama means parent. This word can refer to a parent of any gender. Tomo means building, house, or any indoor location. And last one for this lesson, suno means sun, light source, or light. Oh, that's light as in the opposite of shadow, not light as in the opposite of heavy. Did you get all that? Great. Let's try a few examples. How would you say write your name as a command? Looking back at the vocab, sitelen can be used as a verb to mean write or draw. That's right. O sitelen e nimi sina. Okay, how would you say something like, Susan, Adam is your father? Yeah, it would be something like yan susano, yan atan li mama sina. Remember to use o after names when addressing someone. Also, there's still some room for interpretation with how to transliterate these names. Since m can't be used at the end of a syllable, it's easiest to replace it with n in a case like this. Okay, what do you think nasin isilan li suli means? Remember, nasin can be used to refer to ideologies or belief systems like religions. Right, literally it would be the way of isilan is large or significant. Isilan could mean a number of things, but in context here it seems most likely that it's referring to the religion of Islam. Extra points if you figured that out. Alright, what would kulupu o lukin, suno li seli mute mean? Yep, it's something like, group, look, the light is very hot. Suno could mean the sun as well as a lamp or light bulb. One more, what would yansona o yansonia li pali e tokipona mean? Yes, something like knowing people. The person named Sonia created tokipona. Yansona could be translated as scholar, expert, genius, teacher, or anything similar. Okay, well, that's everything for this video. I know stuff is getting a little bit more complicated, but if you keep practicing, you'll be Yansona yourself in no time. Be sure to come back next, where we'll be learning how to ask questions. Until then, mitawa!